Hello everyone, and welcome to Voices Behind Reddit. Here we bring you the best stories from Reddit where real experiences and captivating tales come to life. Let's get started.
My wife's betrayal and my plan to take back control. True story of divorce and revenge. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, just like any other. Joel sat at the breakfast table, savoring a cup of coffee, listening to the soft hum of the world around him. The smell of toast in the air, the faint light spilling through the window. It all felt so familiar, so routine. But this morning, the silence was broken by a sentence he never expected to hear. Across the table, his wife, Lucy, took a breath and said, "I want a divorce." No warning, no prelude, just those 4 words delivered so casually. But to everyone's surprise, especially Lucy's, Joel didn't react with anger or confusion. Instead, he just looked at her with a calm expression and said, "All right." Now here's the part that stung. Joel already knew. He knew about her ongoing affair, about Rick, the man she'd been seeing behind his back. This wasn't news to him. He had pieced it together quietly over the last few months. And yet, instead of confronting her, he chose silence, biding his time, planning his next move. But why wasn't he reacting? Why was he so calm? Lucy couldn't understand it, and honestly, part of Joel wondered too. The truth is, after all he'd learned, he'd already started to detach from the marriage in his mind, preparing himself for this moment. He was ready to let go. So, while Lucy expected drama, anger, maybe even a fight, Joel surprised her with his quiet acceptance. Her frustration grew, but he stayed firm. With his simple response, he took control of the situation. And as Lucy grew more visibly upset, Joel just stood up, calmly picked up his keys and left for work. That day marked the beginning of Joel's journey, a journey that would test his resilience, challenge his emotions, and force him to take a stand for himself. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about securing his peace, his independence, and his future. Initial reaction and plan. Leaving the house that morning, Joel knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let himself get caught up in the drama. Lucy's affair, her decision to leave, all of it was beyond his control now. But there were still things he could control, and he wasn't about to let those slip. On the drive to work, his mind raced not with anger or sadness, but with decisions. In his heart, he'd already accepted that their marriage was over. He'd been the one holding things together, but now that the truth was out, he knew he had to start taking steps. Fast. Joel decided, right there in the car, that he would secure his finances before anything else. Lucy had been reckless in some ways, but he wasn't going to be. He built a life for himself, and he was determined to protect it, even if it meant making hard choices. As soon as he got to his office, he began taking action. He called the bank and closed all their joint accounts, leaving no loose ends. He knew that once divorce proceedings began, things could get complicated financially, and he wanted to make sure he was prepared. It was time to reclaim what was his. He went through each step with a clear mind, emptying their shared safe deposit box, canceling their joint credit cards. It wasn't about revenge. It was about securing his independence. This way, Lucy couldn't make any claims on their assets, and he could start fresh without worrying about shared finances holding him back. Later that day, he called Mike, his best friend and trusted lawyer. Mike had always been the one to give him sound advice, and this time was no different. Mike listened, nodding quietly as Joel laid out the situation. And then, in that calm, steady way of his, Mike offered one crucial piece of advice: file for divorce first. By doing that, Joel could take control of the legal process, setting things on his terms. It was a small but powerful move, one that would give him the upper hand when things got challenging. The advice sank in. Filing first meant Joel could steer the course of the proceedings, and he needed that now more than ever. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about protecting himself, his work, his future. Joel took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of relief. With each step, he was getting closer to a life where he could finally breathe without the weight of betrayal on his shoulders. Financial safeguards. The next step was all about security. Joel knew that money could become a weapon in the wrong hands, especially in situations like these. He wasn't willing to take that risk, not after everything he'd gone through. So he focused on protecting what he had built. He went back to the bank, but this time it felt different. The joint accounts were already closed, but now he was making sure every shared asset was untangled, his financial safety net tucked away where only he could access it. It was a strange feeling, liberating and heavy at the same time. This was more than just money. It was his hard work, his late nights, his years of dedication, all finally secured for himself alone. Then he went to their shared safe deposit box, Every item inside, from documents to small mementos, was like a reminder of a life he was now stepping away from. But he couldn't afford to look back. One by one, he removed the contents, taking only what was rightfully his. He was leaving behind anything he didn't need, shedding the weight of memories he no longer wanted to carry. The last thing on his list was their joint credit cards. Those he cancelled without hesitation. By ending these financial ties, he was signaling a new chapter. There'd be no shared expenses, no more questioning where their money was going. This was his clean slate, and he intended to keep it that way. By afternoon, he'd done all he could financially to protect himself. But he wasn't done yet. Joel went back to his office and called Mike again, ready to take the next step. Mike had been preparing the paperwork for him to file, and they both agreed it was time. If he filed for divorce first, Joel would have a say in how things unfolded, avoiding surprises later on. This wasn't about being ruthless. It was about being careful, making sure that everything was fair, clear, and fully in his control. The last thing Mike suggested was something Joel hadn't considered, a restraining order. With Rick in the picture, Joel had reasons to feel uneasy. While he wasn't afraid, he wanted to be cautious, to cover all his bases. So they went through with it. By filing that order, Joel was drawing a line, marking the boundaries that Lucy and Rick wouldn't be able to cross. That evening, sitting alone at his desk, Joel felt a quiet sense of relief. In a single day, he had turned a messy, uncertain situation into one he could handle. Step by step, he was building a path forward, one where he could feel secure, steady, and strong, preparing for separation. By now, Joel had taken all the steps to secure his finances and start the legal process, but he knew there was still more to prepare. The next big question was his home. The house they built together was more than just a place to live. It held memories, both good and bad, that he couldn't ignore. And while he was willing to part with a lot, he wasn't ready to let go of his home. That's when Emma, his assistant, stepped in. She'd known Joel for years and had seen him through some tough times. With a steady voice and a supportive tone, she suggested something he hadn't thought of: changing the locks. It was a simple idea, but one that could make a huge difference in keeping things clear and setting a boundary. Joel hesitated at first, but Emma's advice made sense. He needed to make it clear that he was moving forward, that he wasn't going to leave any doors open, literally or figuratively, for Lucy to step back into his life whenever she wanted. So with her help, he arranged for a locksmith to change the locks that very evening. But there was one last piece to this plan: serving Lucy the divorce papers. This was a step he didn't look forward to, but it was necessary to move forward. Joel decided to send the papers to her workplace, a decision he made not out of bitterness, but out of practicality. He knew that a clean, clear message was better than a drawn-out, messy confrontation at home. The following day, the papers were served, and word spread quickly around Lucy's office. She was caught off guard, blindsided by the move. For years, she had seen Joel as calm, maybe even predictable. But this was a side of him she hadn't expected. When she called him furious and humiliated, Joel didn't engage. He didn't want to fight, and he certainly didn't want to feed into her anger. All he said was, "It's done, Lucy. We both need to move on." Her anger wasn't just about the divorce. It was about losing the control she thought she had over him. But Joel was done playing by her rules. He'd spent months, maybe even years, waiting in silence, putting her needs above his own, hoping that things would improve. Now he was done with waiting. But Lucy didn't accept it quietly. That evening, she showed up at the house, pounding on the door, demanding to be let in. Joel watched from the window as she grew more desperate, trying to get inside to reclaim the control she felt slipping away. When she finally left, she caused enough damage to make her frustration clear. That night, Joel documented everything, knowing it could be useful later. He wasn't about to let this turn into a chaotic, emotional back and forth. With each step he took, he was building his case, strengthening his resolve to move forward on his own terms. The next day, Joel took the evidence to court. The judge reviewed it, and based on her actions, enforced the restraining order. It was a hard moment, seeing their relationship reduced to legal paperwork, but he knew it was the right step. The boundaries were now officially set, and there was no turning back. The confrontation. After that night, everything changed. Joel thought he had put up enough walls to keep the drama at bay, but Lucy wasn't about to let it go. The divorce papers, the new locks, the restraining order, it all pushed her to a place he hadn't seen before. In the days that followed, her frustration only grew. She called him, texting at odd hours, trying to find some way to regain control. Joel remained steady, refusing to engage. He'd spent too long getting caught in her emotional storms. and he wasn't going to let himself get dragged back in now. One evening, Joel came home to find the front door scratched, the lock slightly damaged. It was clear that Lucy had come by again, this time trying to force her way in. The damage was subtle but unmistakable. And while it hurt him to see their relationship reduced to this level, he was also grateful he'd taken the steps he had. That night, Joel documented everything. Photos, notes, every small detail. Not because he wanted to, but because he needed to protect himself. This wasn't the life he'd ever imagined for them, but he couldn't ignore what was happening. The next day, he brought all the evidence to court. It was strange, sitting in that room, presenting proof of the person he'd once trusted the most. But the judge listened, looking over the photos, reading through the notes. And finally, they confirmed the restraining order, giving Joel the security he needed to move forward without looking back. The ruling felt like both an ending and a beginning. He wasn't just protecting his physical space, he was protecting his peace, his future. It was a hard realization, one that came with a mix of relief and sorrow. But he knew it was what he had to do. And as he walked out of that courtroom, a weight lifted from his shoulders. This wasn't the life he planned, but it was his now, fully and completely. For the first time, Joel felt a real sense of closure. He'd finally set himself free, rebuilding and reflection. With the court decision behind him, Joel began putting the pieces of his life back together. It was strange at first, waking up in an empty house. The silence felt different now, less heavy, less painful. For the first time in years, he could breathe without waiting for the next argument, the next issue. He was finally free to focus on himself, to build a life that wasn't bound by the weight of someone else's choices. As the days turned into weeks, Joel found comfort in his daily routines. He returned to his work with a clearer head, no longer distracted by the turbulence at home. And through it all, Emma, his assistant, became more than just a co-worker. She was a steady presence in his life, someone he could trust, someone who had seen him at his lowest and still believed in him. Slowly, their connection grew, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. They started spending more time together outside of work, dinners, conversations that stretched late into the evening, quiet moments that didn't need words. Emma was patient, never rushing him, letting him heal at his own pace. With her, he felt understood in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Meanwhile, life on Lucy's end was taking its own turns. Her relationship with Rick, the man she'd risked everything for, began to crumble. The excitement that had once fueled their affair faded, and soon enough, Rick admitted that he was never looking for anything serious. Lucy had made her choice, but it didn't lead to the happiness she'd expected. Joel heard bits and pieces through mutual friends, but he chose not to dwell on it. He'd already lived through enough pain and bitterness. This was his time to rebuild, to focus on his future, not on the past. Months went by, and each day brought a new layer of healing. Joel found himself laughing more, feeling lighter. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined him. He'd learned how to protect himself, how to set boundaries, how to trust again. But most importantly, he'd learned how to move on. Then 6 months later, the divorce was finalized. Joel stood in his lawyer's office, signing the final papers. It felt surreal, like closing a chapter he'd thought would last forever. But there was no sadness, only a quiet sense of peace. He'd come out the other side stronger, more certain of who he was and what he deserved. As he walked out of the office, he looked up at the sky, taking a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, the future looked bright. This was his chance to live fully, to let go of the past, and to embrace whatever came next. Conclusion. With the final papers signed, Joel felt a strange calm settle over him. It was done. The chapter he'd once thought would last a lifetime had closed. Walking away from the courthouse, he realized just how much he had endured and, even more so, how much he had grown. His home was now his sanctuary, a place filled with peace instead of tension. Each corner felt lighter, free from the weight of the past. Joel had reclaimed it, not just as a place to live, but as a space where he could truly be himself. The life he'd imagined, one without constant worry, was finally within reach. Joel's connection with Emma deepened in ways that felt natural and honest. She wasn't filling a void or distracting him from the past. She was part of his new beginning. Together, they shared laughter, quiet moments, and dreams of what life could look like. And unlike before, he felt no need to hold back or question his happiness. As for Lucy, she became a distant memory. Joel didn't carry bitterness toward her anymore. He simply accepted what had happened. She had made her choices, and he had made his. Life was moving forward, each of them on separate paths. Looking back, Joel saw his journey as more than just a story of divorce. It was a story of resilience, of learning to protect himself, of understanding the power of letting go. He had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and uncertainty, yet here he was, standing stronger than ever. With the final chapter closed, Joel felt ready for whatever came next. His life, once shaped by someone else's decisions, was now his own. And as he stepped into this new phase, he knew one thing for sure: he would never again settle for less than he deserved. Thank you for following Joel's journey. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing for more real-life stories of resilience and healing. Until next time, remember, sometimes moving forward is the most powerful step we can take.